In 1961, when Harlem was alive with the spirit of black power and pride, Vito Genovese made a decision that would forever change the course of his life. Harlem, a cultural bastion for Black America, had always stood as an independent empire, run by men like Bumpy Johnson, who commanded the respect of his community. Genovese, the head of the Genovese crime family, saw Harlem as just another piece of territory to claim, a business venture where money, not morals, was the bottom line. But Genovese misjudged the heart of Harlem. He didn't understand that the streets weren't just business to the people, they were life, culture, and the soul of a community. When Genovese demanded tribute from Harlem streets, protection money for his men, he didn't realize he was stepping into the domain of a legend. Bumpy Johnson, a man whose very name struck fear and respect into the hearts of both allies and enemies, wasn't someone who bowed to outside forces, especially not the Mafia. Harlem belonged to the people, and that included Bumpy. Genovese's intrusion would become the catalyst for a reckoning, a confrontation between Black power and Italian Mafia dominance. What Genovese didn't know was that Harlem's king would not bend or submit. The streets of Harlem were about to witness the true meaning of respect and power, as Bumpy Johnson's final words would make even the feared Genovese family bow before the might of Black America. Vito Genovese was no stranger to power. He had built his empire through ruthless tactics and manipulation, weaving his influence from Manhattan to Brooklyn. The Genovese crime family was one of the 5 families of New York, and Vito, its leader, carried the weight of that power like a crown. His empire was built on fear, loyalty through intimidation, and the control of both legitimate and illegal businesses. He saw his influence over New York as complete, each neighborhood his to command. But Harlem was different. To Genovese, Harlem was just another avenue for expansion, another neighborhood to dominate. However, he made a grave miscalculation. Harlem had its own king, Bumpy Johnson, a man who had come from the streets, who had fought, bled, and built Harlem with his own hands. Bumpy didn't just run numbers or rackets, he ran the pulse of Harlem itself. Bumpy was not an ordinary gangster. He was a protector of his people, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. The Black community revered him not just because of his control over the streets, but because of his unwavering commitment to their survival and prosperity. His moral compass was shaped by respect, not fear. And his vision for Harlem was clear. It would never bow to outside forces, especially not a foreign mafia family. Genovese's attempt to impose tribute on Harlem wasn't just a business transaction. It was an affront to the community Bumpy had spent his life building. Genovese's arrogance would cost him dearly. The people of Harlem weren't afraid. They had Bumpy Johnson, a man who believed in protecting what was his and who would stop at nothing to ensure Harlem remained untouchable. The deeper stakes of the conflict were about far more than money. Vito Genovese's demand for tribute represented a violation of the very fabric of Harlem. It was a direct challenge to the independence and sovereignty of the Black community, a community that had fought against oppression and inequality for generations. Genovese saw power as control over territory. For him, a tribute was just another business expense, a way to extend his reach. But for Bumpy, the issue wasn't about money, it was about power. It was about the respect Harlem had earned over the years, and the principle that no one, not even the most feared crime family in New York, could impose on that power without consequence. The moment Genovese made his demand, he crossed a moral line. He threatened not just Bumpy's empire, but the cultural and racial pride of an entire community. Harlem wasn't a city to be ruled. It was a place of freedom, of resistance, and of self-determination. Bumpy Johnson had spent his life ensuring that the people of Harlem had their own voice, their own power. Genovese's intrusion was a direct challenge to everything Bumpy stood for. The confrontation was inevitable. Harlem would not be silent, and Bumpy Johnson was not a man who would allow another to dictate the rules. The people of Harlem would stand with Bumpy just as they had always done. This was more than a battle for control over the streets. It was a fight for the very soul of Harlem, and for black power in the face of systemic oppression. Little did Genovese know, he had just stepped into a war he couldn't win. The man he underestimated was about to remind him, and the world, that true power isn't taken, it's earned through respect. And that lesson would be taught in the streets of Harlem, where Bumpy Johnson was king. It started when Vito Genovese sent his men into Harlem with a simple but clear demand: tribute. His men, members of the Italian Mafia, had already infiltrated several businesses and were now pushing for more control, more power, more money from Harlem's thriving streets. They were sent to collect what Genovese deemed owed to him, a percentage of the take, protection money. But they didn't understand Harlem. They didn't understand Bumpy Johnson. One evening, Willie "Bobo" Davis, a low-level enforcer working under Genovese, entered one of Harlem's most popular jazz clubs, a spot where the rhythm of the music was matched only by the beat of the streets. The club, owned by one of Bumpy's men, had been a safe haven for Harlem's youth, a place where they could come together, listen to the sound of freedom, and escape the pressure of the outside world. Bobo walked in like he owned the place, his attitude thick with arrogance. He walked up to the bartender, a quiet, older black man who'd been serving drinks in Harlem for decades. Without a word of greeting, Bobo slammed a heavy envelope onto the counter. "Tell your boss, Bumpy Johnson," Bobo sneered, "that Vito Genovese demands his cut, 40%, or we'll start collecting from every one of his establishments." The bartender, his hands trembling, simply nodded. But Bobo's words weren't just a threat, they were a violation. Harlem didn't bow to outsiders, especially not men like Bobo, who used fear to control what they didn't understand. This was the moment that set everything in motion. Unbeknownst to Bobo, one of Bumpy's men, Terry T-Bone Adams, had been in the back of the club, and he overheard the whole conversation. He didn't flinch. He didn't say a word. Instead, he calmly walked out into the back alley and made a phone call that would forever change the balance of power in New York. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to hear much. The moment T-Bone's call came in, Bumpy knew exactly what had happened. He knew Genovese was making a move into Harlem. He had seen the signs before. The Mafia was never content with their slice of the pie. They wanted everything, and that always meant trouble for Harlem. But Bumpy wasn't a man to act hastily. He wasn't a man who let his emotions rule his actions. Sitting in his office, Bumpy took a long drag from his cigarette, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. He had lived through countless wars, both in the streets and in the boardrooms. He had been underestimated, betrayed, and challenged more times than most men could count, but he had always come out on top because he understood one truth: power isn't about what you take, it's about what you earn. As Bumpy exhaled the smoke, he said quietly, "They think Harlem's just another neighborhood to be run, but they don't know Harlem." He looked up at his lieutenant, Teddy "Slim" Jenkins, who was watching him closely. "Slim," Bumpy said, his voice calm but firm. "You know what we do. We give respect, but we demand it back. Tell everyone to keep their heads down. We'll let them think they won, for now. Bumpy was never one to rush into a fight. He knew the power of patience. He could feel the tension building, the quiet before the storm. His people had always known he wouldn't make a move until the time was right. And right now, the time wasn't quite there. Genovese had made his play, but Bumpy wasn't about to let him win without a lesson in respect. Days passed, and Harlem went about its business as usual. The streets were busy, filled with life, hustle, and the sound of laughter. But there was an undercurrent of tension, the kind that only people like Bumpy Johnson and his men could feel. They were waiting for something, and they knew it wouldn't be long before the trap was set. Genovese's men had already made their move. They expected Bumpy to give in, to pay the tribute. But Bumpy wasn't that type of man. His calm was calculated. He knew the streets like the back of his hand, and he understood what Genovese didn't. Harlem was more than just a city. It was a symbol. It was a place where power had a different meaning. In Harlem, power wasn't just measured by dollars. It was measured by respect. Meanwhile, Genovese, sitting in his Manhattan offices, had no idea that he was walking into a trap. His men were brash, confident that their mafia status would give them the upper hand. They thought Harlem was weak, that Bumpy's time was running out, that the black community would fall in line as they had with other mafia families. But Bumpy had been preparing for this moment for years. He didn't need to make a loud declaration. He didn't need to gather an army. Bumpy knew the right men to call, the right time to strike, and the right message to send. His people would stand with him, and when the moment came, they would strike fast and hard. Bumpy's plan was simple, but it was brilliant. He'd let Genovese think they had won, let his men believe they could continue their push into Harlem. But Bumpy knew that to strike with precision, he needed to wait. He needed to let the arrogance of the Genovese family grow. He wanted them to feel untouchable, to make a mistake that would cost them everything. The night before the confrontation, Bumpy gathered his closest men, his lieutenants, Slim, T-Bone, and the others, knew the time had come. They had been briefed, but they also understood that the confrontation would be nothing like the street wars they had fought before. This was about making a statement. This was about sending a message to Genovese and every other outsider who thought Harlem was theirs to control. Bumpy didn't need to make a speech. He didn't need to tell them what they already knew. He simply said, "Tomorrow, we show them who runs Harlem. You all know the plan. Stay tight, stay calm, and do what we do best." The trap had been set. It was a crisp evening in late November when Vito Genovese's men arrived at Harlem's Vanguard Club, a popular hotspot for jazz, business, and Bumpy's loyalists. The club had been marked as one of the last unclaimed spots in the district, and Genovese's men were there to take what they believed was theirs. It was just another night to the regulars, with the sound of smooth jazz filling the air and laughter flowing freely. But what no one knew was that this would be the night Harlem would deliver its final judgment. Genovese's men, led by Sal the Bull Gallo, walked in with the same arrogance that had marked every step of their journey into Harlem. They walked past the bar, their boots echoing in the otherwise calm room, heading straight for the back office where Bumpy Johnson usually held court. They didn't notice the subtle shift in the air, the tension in the room. The regulars kept their heads down, knowing not to make a scene, but all eyes were on the door. As Gallo reached for the office door, he stopped. He felt it before he saw it. The door creaked open, and standing in the doorway was Bumpy Johnson, his presence commanding the room in a way that sent an icy chill down the spines of those who thought they were in control. Genovese's men froze for a moment, their arrogant swagger faltering as they saw Bumpy's calm demeanor. But they didn't know what they were up against. They had come to claim what they thought was theirs, but Bumpy wasn't just a man of the streets. He was the embodiment of Harlem's spirit. "Vito Genovese," Bumpy said, his voice low and measured, "sent you to take from me, but Harlem is not yours to take." Gallo sneered, "You don't understand. We're not here to ask, Johnson. This is our time." Bumpy stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Gallo's. "You think power comes from fear," he said, "but true power comes from respect. You demand, but you don't understand how things work here." The tension was palpable. The entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to unfold. Sal Gallo's eyes shifted, and for a brief moment, he understood. The realization hit him hard. He had underestimated the king of Harlem, and now he was facing the consequences of that mistake. He reached for his gun, but before his hand could even touch the handle, it was too late. Bumpy had already moved, his men flanking the door, the sharp sound of boots hitting the hardwood floor, drowned out by the sound of the gunshot from across the room. Slim had fired the shot, swift, silent, and deadly. Gallo dropped to the floor, his gun still half drawn, his life snatched away in the blink of an eye. There was no grand speech, no bloodshed to follow, just silence. Genovese's men understood what had just happened. They had crossed a line that no one had the privilege to cross. They were trespassers, and Harlem had made its decision. Bumpy's calculated action wasn't a random burst of violence. It was measured, precise, and as swift as Harlem's heartbeat. In the end, it was the lesson of respect that had been delivered, not just to Genovese's men, but to every power-hungry outsider who had ever considered Harlem a place to conquer. Bumpy had long understood that the streets could never be ruled by fear alone. They were ruled by respect, the kind of respect that came from loyalty, from understanding the people you served, and from never underestimating the heart of a community. As the Genovese men were escorted out, their eyes wide with terror and realization, Bumpy turned to T-Bone and Slim. "We don't fight to destroy," he said, his voice calm but filled with the wisdom of a lifetime spent on these streets. "We fight to protect what's ours." Bumpy didn't need to say more. The message had been delivered, loud and clear. Harlem wasn't just a place. It was a fortress of black power and pride. And no one was going to tear that down. Not as long as Bumpy Johnson was standing. The aftermath rippled through Harlem and beyond. The Genovese family, humiliated and left with a bitter taste of defeat, knew their hold on Harlem was broken. Vito Genovese, once a titan in the Mafia world, now had a new understanding of what it meant to challenge Bumpy Johnson and the people he protected. It wasn't just a loss of men, it was a loss of respect, and that was something far more damaging in the underworld. For Harlem, the streets were quieter after the confrontation, but the lesson lingered. The people of Harlem knew that their king, Bumpy Johnson, had shown them the true meaning of power. They had witnessed firsthand the price of disrespect, and they had seen the strength that came from unity and unwavering resolve. Bumpy's legend only grew in the years that followed. He had cemented his place not only as the ruler of Harlem, but as a symbol of resistance to oppression. His actions that night sent a message to every corner of New York. Harlem would never bow to anyone, not the mafia, not the system, and not any outsider who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. And while the Genovese family may have licked their wounds and licked their pride, they knew that in the streets of Harlem, the name Bumpy Johnson would be remembered forever. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson story's history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Bumpy's shoes? How would you have protected your people? More legendary stories are coming next day. Don't miss it.